Hey, it's Drybear. We've got season 2 just over the horizon. We've got patch notes. We've gone through the dev stream. If you're looking for my full reaction on the dev stream, I have posted that on my new channel, Drybear TV. So you can see the full detail of that as I go through all the explanations of what's going on. And I've also gone through the patch notes at a high level that you'll find on the channel linked down below as well. But today I want to talk about the specific change of the damage buckets. Vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and overpower. So as some people have asked what's going on with that, what does it mean, as it's a little confusing. So today we're going to demystify that change. Let's start with an overview to catch people up who may not have, are not aware of the terminology or what was going on in season 0 and season 1. So there were this idea of damage buckets, which you can think of as just a grouping of damage stats. So things like damage to slowed enemies, damage with lightning, damage with earth, damage with fire. All of those things that you're building on your character to make your character do more damage, not all of those were treated exactly the same. They were actually put into specific groupings of categories that they were used to calculate how the damage output was made. And there was an additive or an add category where most of the damage in the game existed inside of. So all of these damage while you're in werewolf, increased damage while you are hitting an enemy that is slowed, while you're hitting an enemy that's stunned, all of those kind of fell into the same bucket or grouping of stats. It was just an additive bucket. And these were all, they would just be added together. So if you had like 10% and 5% and 200% and 8% and 20%, it would add all these together and then it would get a final number, and then it would multiply that final number by your damage to get the total damage number. Now, this wasn't the case for a couple of stats, and you may have heard in season 0 and season 1 that critical strike damage and vulnerable were by far better than everything else in the game. And the question is, why was that? Why was that the case? And that was because they were in their own bucket, separate from everything else, and that bucket essentially became its own multiplier, which means that if you had, 5% vulnerable, 10% vulnerable, 8% vulnerable, 40% vulnerable, rather than adding these together and then multiplying, it was multiplying each time, which means that you were getting orders of magnitude more value out of vulnerable and out of critical strike. So your crits and your vulns were being treated much more effectively than everything else in the game, which meant that even if you had a pure lightning build with as much lightning percent damage as you could get, and you were stunning them, and you had damage against stunned, and you had, damage based on movement, and you had all of your things put together, and you had a build that at least conceptually made sense to you in your head, it would pale in comparison to a build that simply just built all vulnerable and critical strike, because at the end of the day, it was a bigger multiplier on your final damage number. And this was overall the most criticized thing among many things for Diablo 4 in season 0 and season 1. And going into season 2, they mentioned that they wanted to fix this. They do not like the fact that it's there. No one really likes the fact that it's there. It ruins build variety. So going into season 2, they have given us our answer on what they're going to do with vulnerable and crit to make it a little bit more of an equal ecosystem for the stats that you choose to put on your character. So put simply, what's happening? They are now going to take, so if we take, let's say this is the previous example, right? This is going to be your additive bucket where it adds all the numbers together and then does a multiplier at the end for your damage values there. Then we also had the vulnerable bucket, and the more you put into the vulnerable bucket, it kept adding to your multiplier, which gave you more and more and more value. And then you have your critical strike bucket as well. These were all kind of separate there, which made really big differences from that. So this was, season 0, season 1, right? Season 1 here. They are changing it, so they're going to keep this system at a high level what it is, but they're going to take all of the added values. So if you got percent vuln on your rings, percent vuln on your gloves, percent vuln on your weapon, you got percent crit damage and crit chance on your gloves and rings, and you got it on your offensive slots, and you put it all together. You're taking all of these added values that you're putting through your build, and they're pulling them out of these buckets and putting them in the additive bucket, just like every other stat in the game. So now when you get a ring that has 14%, lightning damage, that's going to more or less be equivalent to 14% vulnerable damage because they are in the same bucket. They're being treated the same way. It just gives you 14% more additive damage to your overall damage number so that all of those get treated the same. And you just kind of want to figure out which ones you want and which ones you don't want. And then the numbers here aren't going to be crazy more valuable. They're more or less weighted the same. However, the calculation stays the same. They are going to take the bucket that has all the additive stats that you can get on Paragon, on your rings and amulets, on your gloves, all over your gear, through your legendary powers, your uniques, all of that. They're going to keep it all inside of here to keep that as a total calculation, but vulnerable and critical strike still exist in the game. So how does that work going into season 2? Now there is going to be the big old bargain bin bucket of all damage you can add to your character through all the choices and interactions that you make as a player into one big damage more. This is your damage bucket. All of your stats go in here. Everything you can add to your character goes in here. But there are just flat, fixed global multipliers that you can get. One is vulnerable damage. Vulnerable is a 20% multiplier now. Global, if the target is vulnerable, they're going to take 20% more damage from you or from anyone that hits it. If you critically strike, it's going to be a 50% multiplier. Always fixed. You cannot change that. So all of these are here as multipliers. However, the extra amounts that you get, that you used to get as new multipliers, aren't going to be there. They're now going to be in the additive bucket. So if you crit, it's going to take all of your damage added together and then multiply that by a fixed 50% value. And you can increase this with stats the same way you did before by adding them, but it won't increase the multiplier. So let's say you have 500% critical strike damage and you critically strike. Then it's going to add a 500% to your bucket of damage. And when it gets a final calculation, it's going to multiply that final number by 50% because you critically striked. You can't change this number. You can't increase it. You can't decrease it. There's nothing you can do to change the multiplier. You can just change your damage value before the multiplier gets added. And like I said, this isn't a very sexy or attractive way to do it, but it's effective because that means that you're just, whatever you add, you're always adding a equal amount of damage based on the number itself, increasing your damage number. And then you have things that can multiply that, and you can get that through powers and other things like that. Same thing goes for vulnerable. It is a fixed 20% multiplier. It's going to get all of your damage put together, add it all to a final number, and then multiply that final number by 1.2, make it 20% bigger, and that's your final value. You cannot increase this 20%. You can't decrease this 20%. It is a fixed multiplier now. It's capped, it's set. If the target's vulnerable, it gets all your calculations done and then makes the vulnerable bigger, which is much better than, if you had a whole bunch of vulnerable. I would say that adding a bunch of damage here in the base and then multiplying is much more consistent than saying, hey, the more vulnerable you add, you can increase your damage by 1400%. Whereas before you would increase a small number a little bit and then you would multiply it. It just doesn't make much sense to do it the way before. So this is how it works in season 2. So you still will be building vulnerable damage or crit damage or lightning damage or whatever. It just means that your choice of damage type is less weighted towards one or the other and more weighted towards what conditions can you improve the most on. So for example, you will benefit from having vulnerable, but say you have an item that has 20% lightning damage on it or 20% fire damage on it, and you have another item in the same slot that has 8% vulnerable. Before, the vulnerable was more valuable because it was a multiplier. Now it's all equal. So the 20% fire damage, if all you do is fire, is worth more than the 8% vulnerable because the number is bigger. And that's all that they're saying about this for season 2, is they just want all of this to get better. Now, there's one major thing to be concerned about in season 2 for this is obviously if you're taking those multipliers and you're reducing them dramatically, right? They're going from 800% multiplier on your damage to 50% multiplier on your damage. That means that every build in the game from previous in season 1 and season 0, the damage output is going to go way down. So the overall numbers you're going to be seeing, the damage you're going to be able to do, all of it is lower than it was before. So that means that in order to make this work, if this is your damage here, they need to lower the HP values and strength of all of the enemies, bosses, and monster encounters in the game as well. And they've done that. Now, they haven't given us exact values on this. They kind of just said, trust me, bro, we did it. It feels good, but we'll see. I don't think sweeping gameplay redesigns ever hit the mark on the first try, but just keep in mind that everything's going to feel different going into season 2 because they've lowered everything. So basically everyone gets nerfed because they're nerfing the thing that everyone was using, and then they're nerfing the monsters and the world to match with that change as well. So all of that being put together means that you're going to get a game that's a little bit more balanced, but maybe less runaway and less intense and explosive from what it was before, which may end up being fine because maybe you want to do a full ice build or you want to do a full minion build or whatever it is. And since you are no longer completely restricted by those 2 stat modifiers, everything is going to be a little bit more accessible to you. Now, the next thing to look at here, which I don't know what to think of it until I actually play it. On paper, it seems okay, but this is one of those things that you really have to mess around with, look at your build and test things. And there's also a change to Fortify that's being added to the game along with this overpower change. That means that I'm going to have to just jump in and try it in order to know exactly how it is. But they're reworking overpower to be very similar. Overpower attacks now deal up to 50% increased damage based on your current life percentage. They're also making it so there's a flat amount of damage increase for the amount of Fortify you have, as well as the amount of base life you have and the amount of life you have above base life, which is your max life increase from your gear and your build. And they've increased the values across the board to balance this out as well. On top of this, they're making it so Fortify generation is based off your max life, not your base life, which is effectively going to be maybe an 80 to 90% increase to all Fortify generation in the game based on the amount of max life you have. So Fortify is going up, which means you can more often get more Fortify, which means you can maintain the fortified status longer, which means that overpower should be a lot more consistent. Does this mean that it's going to scale as well as like crit and vulnerable did before? No, but keep in mind that vulnerable and crit are also being nerfed down. So this actually could end up making overpower one of the best stats in the game. Since it is kind of being treated the same. Now, overpower can't crit, and it doesn't seem to be affected by vulnerable, but we'll see what happens when we go into season 2. So hopefully that's a very short description on how they're changing overpower, critical strike, and vulnerable for season 2. If you found value in the video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and I'll see you on my live stream. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.